turning in and I get for a split second heart attack. There was something else I needed to do alone.
Okay. Vitiligo is a loss of pigment. I am. That's not good. Okay. It is a loss of pigment in certain areas. And what's happening here is that the melanocytes, you're checking yourself? The melanocytes are no longer producing melanin. Now, it's usually more obvious if you have darker skin to begin with. But if you're fair-skinned, it's not as obvious. This is an autoimmune disease. So it is one in which the body is attacking itself. It's breaking its own cells. Hyperkeratosis. Hyperkeratosis is when the stratum corneum, now which layer is that? Is it part of the dermis, epidermis? Stratum corneum. Epidermis. That's that horny layer of the epidermis. When the stratum corneum thickens beyond normal limits. Now remember, those cells of the stratum corneum are dead because they're far away from the blood supply and they're full of keratin. So basically what we're talking about, calluses. On a small scale level, calluses. It can be on a larger scale level. In the case of calluses, it's usually because of friction. Yeah. So in areas that are encountering a lot of friction, so that you're not, because think about it, your epidermis isn't that thick, right? And so if we're going to, it's stratified, so we can lose layers of it. But if there's a lot of friction, we're going to lose a lot more. And so it hardens and it strengthens, so that if you lose layers of the epidermis, you're not getting down to the dermal layer and bleeding and yucky stuff like that.
So the stratum is the outer layer.
Yes. Yes, it is. Blisters. Blisters form when the bonds between the layers of the skin are broken. And once again, this usually has to do with friction because the layers are rubbing against each other and that breaks the bonds. Now, most blisters are between different layers of the epidermis. But if you get one that goes down to the dermis, that's when they fill with blood. That's when you get blood blisters. When they get down to the dermis, because remember, that's where the blood supply is. Hey, I skipped one. Where'd it go? Oh, there it is. Oops. Okay. I included scars on here, even though we've already talked about scars and the formation of scars, so just a reminder. So remember that scars are fibrous connective tissue. And that the downside of scarring versus regenerating tissue is that the scar tissue doesn't have the same function as the tissue that was damaged. And if a tissue is going to scar or regenerate, which one it's going to do, depends on what kind of tissue is damaged, and the severity of the damage. Remember we said that clean cuts are less likely to scar versus jagged ones, which are more likely. Albinism. I had some questions about this yesterday. Albinism is genetic. It is a recessive trait. The melanocytes are still present, but once again, they're not producing melanin. And remember, we talked about yesterday how we have melanocytes in our hair follicles that give our hair color. We have melanocytes, well, they're not exactly melanocytes, but they're very similar to melanocytes in our eyes that give our eyes their color. So they're not able to make the melanin. Jaundice. Jaundice is the yellowing of the skin. And it's caused by the buildup of bile pigments. From the breakdown of red blood cells. Bile, B-I-L-E. Bile is the stuff that's produced by the liver. Breakdown of bile pigments. Oh, I'm sorry. Buildup of bile pigments from the breakdown of red blood cells.
Is this like what yellow fever?
No, but there's a relationship, but we're just talking straight yellowing of the skin. Okay, so it can indicate liver problems. It's very common in infants because their livers are not fully developed. But when you're older and that pigment's building up, it indicates liver problems. So this would be like a side effect of yellow fever kind of thing. Bruising. I think you probably already know the answer to this. Bruising occurs when there are ruptured blood vessels beneath the skin. So yesterday when you had the scenario of me bleeding out up here, you knew that those blood vessels, if I had no skin, I wouldn't bruise. Yay.
That's a plus.
Indeed. I just bleed out, that's all.
Just pros. I'm a pros and cons to everything.
When bruises start turning the pretty colors, that's a sign that they're healing. Yeah.
What about when they're like yellow?
Look what we just talked about with the jaundice,
Got it.
breaking down the red blood cells. Okay. And so that bile pigment, so that's a sign that it's healing. It's a good sign.
Is the like purples and like reds and blues, is that like the blood?
In the tissues.
Why is it then like why is it always super like red at first? Is that still the blood?
It's the blood rushing to the area, because whenever you damage a tissue, the first thing that happens is the blood rushes to the area to try and get the healing process started. So that's why.
Okay, so then like basically yellow and the color is
That's a really significant sign of healing.
well, like
Maggie?
so I kind of got ran into it during the soccer game this weekend, and it doesn't look like a bruise, but it definitely hurts. So what would that mean?
Because you have the bone here,
Uh-huh.
the bruise is underneath there.
Awesome. What about when you like wake up and you just have bruises but you don't know what they are? All the time. Is there a scientific explanation for that? Because I've been trying to figure it out. Yeah.
Somebody's been poking you in your sleep. I don't know.
That's horrible to me. It's just some other crap. I'm a bruiser.
Bruiser. The new monster in the bed, the bruiser. All right, male pattern baldness. So we were going to watch a short clip of a video just kind of doing an overview of what we've been talking about the last couple of days with the integumentary system. And the narrator of this was a bald guy, and the video clip gets up to the end and he talks about how many hairs we have on our body, except for some of us don't have so many. And then it cuts to, your doctor is going to do a skin graft on you. What? Where what? Where'd you come from? We said, that's been decided. Well, we're going to watch part of that video, but not any of that part. Okay. So with male pattern baldness, we've talked about this before, that male pattern baldness is genetic. And the gene is triggered by the presence of testosterone. So males who have a lot of testosterone tend to have all those other effects of testosterone, like really hairy bodies. But if they have the gene, it's going to trigger the gene and they'll lose the hair on their heads. Indeed it is. Oof. Now, even though we refer to it as male pattern baldness, females can have it too. Ours usually isn't triggered, though, until after menopause. Because even though we're making testosterone all along, we're also making the estrogens and progesterone and other things that can kind of counteract it. But after menopause, not so much, and then it can trigger the gene.
So, can men start balding like in puberty?
Shortly after, yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
That's sad.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's okay. It's fine. We'll survive. We're fine. We're fine.
We'll just go into it knowing, you know, never mind, I'm not going to say that. Whiteheads and blackheads are considered a very mild form of acne. It's when the sebaceous glands, when the ducts from the sebaceous glands get blocked with sebum. When the ducts of the sebaceous glands get blocked with sebum. Mm-hmm. And when the sebum oxidizes, it turns that dark color. So that's where the blackhead part comes in. So that leads nicely then into acne. And when we, like I said, we consider whiteheads and blackheads to be a mild form of acne. So the difference is that with what would be considered like full-blown acne, still the sebaceous ducts are blocked. But they're blocked with sebum and with bacteria, which is what leads to the inflammation. Impetigo. Impetigo is a bacterial infection that usually affects children. And it creates reddish blisters or crusts. Usually around the mouth and the nose. It also can be found on the hands and feet. It's very contagious. So if your child has this, don't send them to school. This is not, and I'm glad you asked that though, because I was going to mention that. The difference is hand, foot, mouth is viral. And we're going to see some images of some of these a little bit later. Something to look forward to.
Well, yeah, I'm assuming I read that as Tina.
Oh.
Tina. Whatever it is, I was like, Tina is just an issue. Tina's an issue.
All right. Tinea is a group of disorders that are mycoses. Mycoses are fungal infections. So things like yeast infections, jock itch, athlete's foot, ringworm. I think I should have done the recording today with the camera facing you guys because your expressions as I'm talking about some of these things are great.
Well, I like that it was just, they were like, it was like, I don't know. Just escalate rapidly. Ringworm.
Okay, so fungi, remember from biology, fungi like warm, moist places, right? So they grow on the surface of the skin in warm, moist places.
So, could this also cause like warts like on your feet?
Most warts are viral, and we're actually, it's on my list here.
My brother got some from like the showers in school.
Oh, yeah.
On his feet, and like they're pretty bad. So showers really sort of
It can look similar, but it's not the same thing. Psoriasis. Good to know. Good to know.
and Kylie.
Psoriasis is another autoimmune disorder. And it is a chronic one, meaning that it's recurring. And it's similar to cancers in that it causes excessive growth of the epithelial tissue. So there's lots of cell division going on. And then it manifests itself as scaly. It looks scaly. But the scales might have redness around them because the scales will get inflamed. So if inflammation occurs, I'm sure you've seen the commercials, all the psoriasis treatments.
Apparently. I get hives when I'm stressed out. That's good. I get hives when I'm like really hot. Don't listen to me.
Yes, here you go. Here are your warts.
Wait, what are hives?
Just inflammations. They're localized
Can they be
inflammations.
caused by heat or is it just?
They can be. They can be.
Well, I get hives when my legs get hot, so I thought it was allergic to something.
Warts are caused by a virus. And the virus that causes warts is in the family of the papillomavirus. This is your HPV. It's in that same family. Well, and the one in the family causes genital warts. Okay, let's see. Where are we on time? We're good. Okay. Bed sores. Decubitus ulcers. These are caused by a diminished blood supply to the area. So being in one position for too long and there being pressure put on the area.
Diminished blood supply to what?
To the area. due to pressure. So usually they first occur in bony areas because the bone is pushing up against it and cutting off that blood supply. And so the ulcers form and then they get inflamed. Contact dermatitis. This is an inflammatory reaction to touching something, such as poison ivy.
So would this be like if they were lettuce in the grass and then turn red?
Kind of, but not exactly, because that's more of an allergy thing. Whereas with poison ivy, it's actually a chemical in the poison ivy that when you touch it, that's what causes the inflammation. So it's kind of along the same lines though, because with allergies, it's just your body thinks it's something harmful even though it's not.
That's what allergies are?
Mm-hmm.
Just interesting. You got it.
Eczema is actually not a disease of its own. It's a sign of something else. It's a sign of another condition. And so eczema can take lots of different forms. It could be bumps or blisters or crusts. That word needs to go up there too. Okay, well, the marker's back there. So. Crusty.
Did we add phalanges? I didn't write it down.
Do we have what?
Did we add phalanges?
We did not add phalanges.
What's it a sign of? Like what?
It can be a sign of allergies. It can, yeah, or it can be a sign of other disorders. But allergies are a common one. I had a friend in high school. She developed eczema from allergies, and it manifested itself basically as hyperkeratosis. She was like just big, scaly, lots of, yeah, very thick epidermis, and then at her joints, it would always just break.
Ow.
When she bent her joints.
Ouch. Ouch.
Yeah.
No.
Get the things like they do on your feet, you know, and just
Oh, that's so nice.
All right.
Yeah.
So we're going to come back to skin cancer. But first, I think we really need to watch this video.
Or DNA. Yes.
I actually have that written in my notes. Okay, so 45 common skin disorders.